short background before we get to your role during the pandemic. You were employed as a special advisor to the Scottish Government for bringing the contents of this statement through to the best of your
Good morning.
Good morning, my lady. The first witness this morning is the Right Honourable Michael Gove MP.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thanks. Mr. Gove, I'm sorry that we've had to call you back again. I do understand the difficulties it may cause, but it was necessary, I'm afraid.
Of course. Thank you.
You are Michael Gove?
Yes.
You've helpfully provided a number of statements to the inquiry, but two particularly to this module. The first, if we could have it up, please, is INQ 000371583. It's a statement dated the 14th of December 2023. Is that your statement?
It is.
You have signed the statement?
Yes.
Do the contents of that statement remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
Yes.
You've helpfully also provided us with an additional short statement, supplementary statement, with the reference INQ 000236648. This is a statement dated the 25th of January 2024. Is that also your statement?
It is.
And have you signed that statement?
Yes.
Do the contents of that statement remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
They do.
Thank you. You're a member of the UK Parliament for Surrey Heath?
Yes.
You were first elected to the UK Parliament in 2005, is that correct?
Yes.
You are currently the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities?
Yes.
You are also currently the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations?
Yes.
In your statement, you explain that you became significantly less involved in any aspect of the pandemic response after September 2021. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, it is.
In the period between January 2020 and September 2021, you were the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Yes.
From mid-February 2020, you became Minister for the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
And after September 2021, you continued to have contact with the devolved administrations, including the Scottish Government, in your post as Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, but not in the context of the pandemic response. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As I say, you've given evidence already in connections with Module 1 and 2, both in statement form and in oral evidence. You're here today to give evidence in relation to the Scottish Government's decision-making and indeed the UK Government's decision-making insofar as it related to Scotland. I understand that you performed a role during the course of the pandemic as the Minister in the UK Government who acted as something of a conduit between the two governments. Would that be fair?
Yes, it would.
Over what period did you perform that role?
Essentially from the very beginning of the pandemic until the reshuffle in September of 2021 when I was appointed to my current post.
Would it be fair to say that in the exercise of that particular role, although you didn't hold principal ministerial responsibility for a number of areas, you're required to keep abreast of developments within both the UK government and the Scottish government with regard to the pandemic, so as to be able intelligently to discuss with the Scottish government matters relating to the pandemic response across the UK.
Yes, to the best of my ability.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions about the interaction between the devolution settlement and the pandemic response. The module has already heard significant evidence about the devolution settlement. Is it fair to say, as we've heard from other witnesses, that although the Scottish Government and the UK Government make decisions separately as regards matters within their respective devolved and reserved competencies, one might say that they share overall responsibility for policy decisions that impact Scotland?
Yes.
Reserved UK government and devolved Scottish government policies both impact outcomes in Scotland.
Yes.
And decisions, even decisions made by the UK government with regard to its exclusive areas of competence in other parts of the United Kingdom, will have had an indirect effect on matters within Scotland as well.
Yes.
That's perhaps because, although these structures are man-made structures, the virus and its epidemiological flow did not respect those borders and structures.
Precisely so.
At all relevant times during the pandemic, the Scottish Government had devolved responsibility for public health, the health of Scotland more generally, the NHS, including hospitals, schools, and the social care sector. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
In your evidence to Module 2, you were asked some questions about this area, and you said on the 28th of November, it's at the transcript at page 116, which is available on the website, health is devolved and public health is devolved, but there is a distinction, I think, between two different types of public health intervention. On the one hand, there's the straightforward public health intervention, like keeping ourselves healthier, how much fruit do we eat, and so on. That's quite properly a matter for the devolved administrations. But when you are dealing with a pandemic, and a pandemic which is raging across one island, Great Britain, then I do think that there is a case for saying that there can and should be certain UK-wide powers exercised at the centre. I think that it is an open question to draw that distinction between two different types of public health interventions, because, again, one of the points that Michelle O'Neill makes very fairly is that the island of Ireland is a single epidemiological area. It was always regarded so in terms of animal health and a fortiori in terms of human health. So again, these are difficult issues to manage, and I wouldn't say that this was a view that I hold passionately, but I do think that the whole question about how you can ensure that the UK government, short of the Civil Contingencies Act, can say, look, we need to override some sort of independent decision-making you might make, I think that's worth considering. Was it fair to say that in advance of the pandemic, it was reasonably foreseeable that in a health emergency of the nature of the pandemic which the UK faced, it would require, given the underlying devolution settlement, a degree of cross-border cooperation?
Yes.
Would you say that it was necessary for there to be clarity as regards precisely what fell within the ambit of the Scottish Government's responsibility under the devolution settlement, and what it was that the UK Government would do insofar as impacted upon Scotland?
Yes, and I think that there is a case for greater clarity overall about devolved and reserved responsibilities.
Would it have been possible for greater clarity in that regard to have been achieved, given the fact that it was reasonably foreseeable in such a situation that cross-border cooperation would be necessary?
Yes, I think that, again, we dealt with a virus which was unprecedented in the speed with which it spread and also its lethality, but it is certainly the case that the devolution settlement evolves over time. And we can learn from how we responded to this virus to consider how the devolution settlement might be improved in the future. It is, of course, perfectly open to conclude that no constitutional settlement will ever be perfect, and that the current division of responsibilities is broadly right.
But clarity in this regard, in order to maximise the effectiveness of the response, is really key, isn't it?
Clarity is always helpful.
Is the distinction that you made in your evidence in Module 2 between public health matters which are clearly devolved, eating more fruit you refer to? We actually heard from Professor Devi Sridhar, public health expert, who talked about measures to fight obesity, smoking, alcohol consumption, all of which she had some involvement in. Is the distinction between that type of public health responsibility and some other type of public health responsibility a constitutional legal principle, as far as you're concerned?
No, I believe that it's a practical operational question, and it relates, of course, to how we can protect the health of everyone within a particular geographic entity, in this case the island that is Great Britain. So a case has been made, and it's one to which I'm sympathetic, that when one's thinking of some biosecurity measures in respect of dealing with a virus, for example, questions over international travel or testing at the border, that there is a case for saying that that should be a UK-wide responsibility exercised by the UK government. And I submit to the inquiry that this is a legitimate and respectable point of view, but as I say, there can be arguments either way about the wisdom of going down that route, but it is certainly a case with which I have sympathy.
As far as the position of the UK government during the course of the pandemic is concerned, was it your and the UK government's position that the Scottish government was responsible for matters of public health, such as eating more fruit, but overall the UK government retained responsibility for the management of the virus?
No, I think that it was clear from what happened during the course of the pandemic that the Scottish government was responsible for deciding the non-pharmaceutical interventions that it believed were necessary in order to curtail the spread of the virus.
Did issues around the division of responsibility in this regard remain contentious or difficult throughout the pandemic, in particular as a result of your particular experience of dealing with the Scottish Government in your Four Nations meetings?
No, I think in my evidence I make the point that, of course, there were differences in approach, and of course we had different political parties operating across the United Kingdom, but the day-to-day management of the virus and the day-to-day responsibilities exercised by ministers in the devolved administrations and in the UK government was for the most part constructive.
My question was directed at trying to understand whether there was difficulty as regards the constitutional divide, rather than a subject we'll get onto, the personal interrelationships between people involved. What I was seeking to get at was, did it remain an issue as to what was the UK government's responsibility, what was the Scottish government's responsibility, which may, of course, have impacted upon the effectiveness of the overall response?
I wouldn't want to jump the gun, but I suspect that some might in this module want to make a point about the degree of fiscal devolution that the Scottish Government enjoys, and whether or not that should be greater, and whether or not that would enable the Scottish Government or a future Scottish Government to respond more effectively. I've outlined my views on that question, and I'm happy to return to them and indeed expand on them. But during the course of the pandemic, I did not see any real angst about the constitutional situation preventing effective decision-making and an effective response.
Okay. You mentioned in your earlier evidence the possibility, which I know you've discussed already with others in previous modules, that the way in which the pandemic management division, if you like, could have been approached was the use of the Civil Contingencies Act. You mentioned something short of the Civil Contingencies Act in your previous evidence. Would it not have been, if the UK government wished to exercise a wider control over matters of public health, would it not have been an option, a preferable option, for the UK government to have approached the division of responsibilities through that legal mechanism, about which we have again heard a little from previous witnesses?
Yes, I don't believe so. The Civil Contingencies Act is designed to deal with a catastrophe coming from a clear blue sky, a terrorist incident, or a hostile state actor unleashing the sort of havoc that requires an immediate emergency response. And also, it involves the curtailment of independent action and liberty to an extent that I think most people would find difficult to take, save in such a particular emergency. But I do think that it's worth looking at the operation of the Civil Contingencies Act and considering whether or not between that quite powerful intervention and the other interventions that we saw exercised during the course of the pandemic, might there be a need for a new mechanism or a new way of operating in order to deal with potential future threats to public health or safety?
Was this not literally a catastrophe that came from a clear blue sky?
No, because while it was undoubtedly a horrendous period in the life of our nations, and the loss of life and the pain suffered by many was momentous, the threshold for the Civil Contingencies Act, I think, is rightly very high. And it is the case that whatever successes or failures there were in the management of the pandemic, we could see the pandemic coming. It wasn't as though it were, as I say, like a terrorist attack when you move from a moment of peace and serenity to the sudden dramatic loss of life that such an intervention might precipitate, or, as I say, a foreign state actor attacking. And the Civil Contingencies Act, by its very nature, leads to the centralisation of powers, the restrictions of liberties, that one would have to clear a very high threshold before initiating. So my own view is that the Civil Contingencies Act is too draconian an instrument in many cases for the sorts of challenges that we might face in the future.
The practical result, had that course been followed, I think you've already explained to us, but just to be clear, would have been that the UK government would have had greater power over the way in which the pandemic was managed across the nations of the United Kingdom. Is that broadly correct?
It would have done.
Yes, it would have done.
And it would have had greater power over and control over the actions of local government and individuals and civil society. It is, as I say, by draconian, I don't mean to say that it's never capable of being used, but it should only be used in very sparing and exceptional circumstances.
In the end, the way in which the pandemic was managed, we've heard some evidence from a political expert who talked about the civil contingencies route or the public health route being two options. The public health route was ultimately the one that was taken, if we can use that as a label. Is that fair?
Yes.
What happened was that legislation went through the UK Parliament, which became the Coronavirus Act 2020. In the schedules to that act, specific powers to do things like impose restrictions and ultimately lockdowns were accorded to the Scottish Government. Is that correct?
Yes.
And those powers became vested in the Scottish Government on the 26th of March 2020.
Yes.
Was it your understanding of the Scottish Government's position prior to that point that it was of the view that it had the constitutional power to impose restrictions and lockdowns in any event?
I believe that, I don't know what the Scottish Government thought, but I do believe that the Scottish Government, if the UK Government had chosen not to act, would undoubtedly have pressed us to grant them powers in order to be able to have the sorts of interventions, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdown powers that were subsequently exercised.
But your understanding, do I take from that, was that their position was that the Scottish Government thought that those powers would require to be granted to them, i.e. they did not have them?
Yes.
Thank you. So As far as the legislative framework is concerned, the powers to manage matters of public health, to impose restrictions, lockdowns, or anything short of a lockdown, became clear, at least, on the 26th of March. Is that correct?
It certainly, they were further clarified. I think one of my experiences of devolution is that at different points, in issues arguably less important, the Scottish Government has pushed at the boundaries of the devolution settlement in order to establish that which it can do. It's inherent in the Scotland Act that those things which are reserved are listed and specified, but not those things which are devolved. And there is an argument put forward by the Scottish Government and others that anything that is not explicitly reserved is devolved, and therefore it is open to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to legislate in those areas. I won't stray further into that debate now, but it is certainly the case that some would have argued that even if the UK Government had been idle, that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament would have been empowered to legislate in this area.
Despite, as I think you've accepted, the reasonable foreseeability of the need to have a cohesive, coordinated UK response in an emergency such as this, and the preferability, at least, of clarity around devolved and reserved competencies, this was not a matter which had been discussed or sorted out between the governments before the pandemic arrived, was it?
No, but there were regular occasions where the UK government and devolved administrations would work together to consider how to deal with civil contingencies, and there were also arrangements to discuss how they might deal with pandemics, particularly, as has been discussed elsewhere, the prospect of a flu pandemic, which was the principal operating assumption when it came to a public health emergency that the UK government was operating to.
If there were a concern on the part of the UK government that the Scottish government tended to try to push the boundaries of devolution based on previous experience, it would have been perfectly open to the UK government to clarify the boundaries between each government's area of responsibility in advance as part of those preparedness exercises, would it not?
It would be possible. However, precisely given the tendency, particularly under the Scottish National Party, to see if the devolution boundaries can be pushed, one can't anticipate all of the areas where a Scottish government might choose to push those boundaries. Again, one of the emerging challenges that we all face across the world at the moment is artificial intelligence. At the time of the Scotland Act, AI was not a concept with which any of us were particularly familiar. There is an open question, probably not for this inquiry, so I shan't labour the point, as to whether or not artificial intelligence and the threat that it potentially poses, if not properly regulated, should be regulated at a UK level or at a Scotland or devolved administration level. Again, my argument would be that we should have that discussion now, but we can't always anticipate every future challenge that we may have to face, or indeed every future initiative that a duly elected Scottish Government might wish to press.
In contradistinction to the concept of artificial intelligence, Mr. Gove, public health was a matter to which, as you've said, a considerable amount of attention was paid in advance of the pandemic. Therefore, it was entirely predictable that public health was a matter which required a degree of clarification as to the constitutional boundaries.
Yes, but I don't believe that in the response to the pandemic, that the constitutional questions, which are, of course, of great interest, actually impeded day-to-day our response. So, yes, in a perfect world, a greater degree of constitutional clarity on some of these questions would be preferable, but in the practical day-to-day operation of responding to the pandemic and the virus, I don't believe that these were material considerations.
You'll be pleased to hear, Mr. Gove, I don't intend to take you through vast reams of WhatsApp messages, but I will take you to a few. If we could turn, please, to INQ 000163134, please. These are messages that I understand were provided to the inquiry by Mr. Hancock, and they relate to discussions around a four nations approach to the governance of the Joint Biosecurity Centre in May 2020. Do you recall the discussions around that issue at that time?
I do.
The Joint Biosecurity Centre, I think, was formed as a new directorate within the Department of Health and Social Care in June 2020, eventually, to bring together data science, assessment and public health information and expertise to assist in the fight against the virus. Is that a fair description?
Totally.
Broadly, thank you. Can we just look at these, please? These messages say, if we start at the 30th of May, 2:14 p.m., it is said there that the owner of the cell phone, who I understand to be Mr. Hancock, says, yes, it would be a UK body like MI5. Pandemic response is a reserved responsibility. It's the actions taken in response that are devolved. To which you respond, the sub, which I think should have gone to you, takes a different view based on legal advice. Do let me know if you haven't been sent it. And then the response thereafter from Mr. Hancock is, I've now read the sub. I'm very unhappy with it. The JBC is designed as a UK institution that gathers and analyses data. It executes via many different agencies, local authorities, devolves, OGDs, etc. But there is no need for it to be run through a committee of the 4 nations. We wouldn't put English local authorities on the board. And then at 9:01, Mr. Hancock says, the advice this sub is based on wrongly states that public health is devolved. That is not true. Parts of public health are devolved, fact fighting, local response, but public health emergencies are reserved matter. How can a sub on such an important matter miss such a critical part of the devolution settlement? Let's discuss in the morning. This clearly needs sorting out. So, broadly speaking, what's happening here is there's a discussion over the extent to which this Joint Biosecurity Centre would be a matter for UK government control. Is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Hancock has seen this as part of a more general attitude that he appears to have towards the way in which the public health response is being coordinated, saying the JBC falls within our remit, the UK government remit, because the public health response more generally, in terms of policy making, falls within our remit. Is that broadly correct?
That was Matt's view.
Yes.
Yes.
And what you are doing here is you're bringing to his attention a submission, it would appear to be a legal submission, a piece of advice, which tends to suggest that that interpretation of the devolution settlement may not be correct. Is that right?
Yes. And I think this goes very much to our earlier discussion. In the end, when the JBC was set up, as I think I mentioned, paragraph 74 of my evidence to this module, health ministers from all 4 administrations were on a ministerial board, and the devolved administrations were represented on the Joint Biosecurity Centre's steering board and technical board. So Matt, again, as the inquiry said, Matt, and I think this was a good thing, was a bullish, determined, energetic minister who wanted to ensure that there was rapid and effective action taken in dealing with the virus. My responsibility was to seek to make sure that we worked effectively with all of the devolved administrations. So I didn't seek to temper Matt's energy, but I did seek to ensure that we were operating on all 4s with the devolved administrations. And in the end, we had an effective JBC, broadly in line with Matt's wishes, but one which also involved the devolved administrations and which benefited all.
Is this, Mr. Gove, indicative of a wider attitude within the UK government, at least up to this point, that the UK government was really in control of policy across the United Kingdom with regard to the management of the pandemic?
No, I don't believe so, no. I think that at different times, naturally, there were some within the UK government that occasionally found it irksome that they might have to deal with devolved administrations taking a different view. But overall, the way in which the UK government worked was respectful towards and inclusive towards the devolved administration. So there may have been moments when individuals expressed, as energetic and determined individuals anxious to see action this day, they may have expressed irritation at the need to take account of the devolved administrations, but they would also, at different times, have expressed perhaps irritation with how Public Health England or another part of the government machinery were operating. It's not, I think, a fundamental lack of respect. It's simply an outworking of the energetic impulse of well-meaning and public-spirited individuals.
It may not be a question of lack of respect, Mr. Gove, but it is, I think, an indication as to Mr. Hancock, who, let's be fair, was a central part of the UK government's response. Oh, yes. It's an indication of his understanding of the constitutional position. Despite legal advice to the contrary, he's of the view that public health is devolved and that public health is not devolved, and that statement was incorrect.
Yes, but I think I would balance that against the formidable array of evidence which shows Matt working collaboratively and effectively with health ministers across the United Kingdom. So Matt expresses a view. That view is born of his desire to press ahead energetically. But at the same time, this is one conversation, an important one. But set against that, there are the multiple, not just conversations, but agreements and shared actions that Matt, Jean Freeman, Hamza Yusuf, and others were responsible for. So a single conversation of this kind shouldn't be taken as evidence of the broader attitude that either Matt or the UK government took to effective and coordinated work.
It's your understanding and perspective, as you've said, that Mr. Hancock and others within the UK government worked collaboratively and effectively with the Scottish government and indeed the other devolved administrations over this period. It is a consistent theme, however, of the Scottish government evidence that when attending or engaging in these apparently or these collaborative exercises, they felt very much that decisions had already been made by the UK government and that they were simply being invited to be told what those decisions were. Their position is, in effect, as Mr. Hancock seems to be expressing here, that the UK government thought itself responsible for the public health response across the United Kingdom and that they were merely to be told what the decisions had already been, what they already were.
I don't think that the actual evidence would justify that. Mm-hmm. It was the case at different points that the Scottish Government and indeed other devolved administrations chose a different path. My view was, and I think to be fair, the view of most of those working in the devolved administrations was, that effective coordination and indeed a unified approach wherever possible was desirable. However, there were occasions where the Scottish Government chose a different communication strategy, a different set of lockdown metrics, different ratios for when people could meet outside, and so on. And we not only respected that, but sought to work with the devolved administrations in that area. There were other areas, though, where it was undoubtedly the case that it was the strength of the UK government that was able to help everyone within the UK to respond better. We would not have been able to secure the effective vaccine rollout that we did without the UK government playing the role that it did in setting up the vaccine task force and so on. Of course, the Scottish Government and those working within the Scottish NHS played a heroic role in supporting that. I would take nothing away from them. But I think it is important to recognise that there were critical elements of the pandemic response where we benefited from having the broad shoulders of the UK Treasury and indeed the international negotiating and purchasing power of the UK government.
I think the timeline is potentially significant here, Mr. Gove. What I'm interested, you referenced the fact that there were times, either as regards public communications policy or the substantive strategy towards the management of the virus more generally, the Scottish Government took a different path. The timing of this is significant in that we've already heard evidence that it was around May 2020 where that divergence, which is not a phrase that the Scottish Government witnesses liked very much, but that divergence started really substantively to occur. What I'm interested in is why that divergence took place. Is it your position, Mr. Gove, that there is no substance to the Scottish Government's criticism of the UK Government, in that in the period up to this point, they were excluded from decision-making such that they had to take their own path.
No, I don't think that's a fair characterisation. We strove always to make sure that the views of devolved administrations were heard, respected and fed into UK government decision-making. There was an intensity to the range of conversations at the beginning of the pandemic response that diminished a little as we moved into a period where it appeared that the virus was in retreat. And then, as the intensity of infection recurred, so the intensity of meetings recurred. But the UK was not unique in having conversations between the central government and devolved or regional or other governments in how to respond. And again, one of the points that I made in my evidence is that the federal chancellery in Germany sometimes had to deal with the fact that different Länder were pursuing different policies, and ensuring that there was an effective and unified response across the whole of Germany was a challenge. So yes, if you have devolution of any kind, and there were similar situations in France and Spain, then you will sometimes have divergent responses, because as administrations acquire more information about how to fight the virus, though more options become available, and it is possible for public-spirited individuals in different jurisdictions to argue for a slightly more energetic or a slightly more liberal response.
You mentioned something of the intensity of the initial discussions. We may return to that in a few moments, Mr. Gove. You, as you have already given evidence in Module 2, were heavily engaged, principally engaged, I think, in what are known as the Four Nations meetings that took place. We know that these took place at different times and with a different level of regularity, and we know some of the matters that were discussed at these meetings. Was your mission in setting up these Four Nations meetings to try to do something about the fact that the existing systems for Scottish Government, UK Government collaboration had failed?
No, I don't think they had failed. Prior to the pandemic, my role as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster had been to prepare for Britain's departure from the European Union and the potential eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. In that work, I had a series